My name is Sarah and I'm 30 years old. For most of my adult life, I've worked hard, kept my head down, and done my best to build a career I could be proud of. I've always believed that if you show up, do the work, and treat people with respect, the rest will take care of itself. But as I learned the hard way, that's not always true. Sometimes, the people above you don't care how much effort you put in. They care about power, control, and making sure they come out on top. I had been working at my company for just over 3 years when this story really began. It was a medium-sized firm, not a huge corporate giant, but big enough that politics ran deep in the veins of every department. I worked in operations, which meant long hours, endless spreadsheets, and being the person who made sure everything behind the scenes actually ran the way it was supposed to. It wasn't glamorous, but I was good at it, and I'd built a reputation as someone who could solve problems quickly and keep projects on track. My boss, Mark, had been promoted about 6 months before things started unraveling. He was in his mid-40s, the kind of man who wore expensive suits and always seemed to be rehearsing for some imaginary TED Talk. On the surface, he was charismatic. He knew how to charm upper management and clients with his smooth-talking and confident smile. But underneath that polished exterior, there was something else. He had a temper that flared when things didn't go his way, and he had a habit of taking credit for other people's work. At first, I tried to ignore it. I told myself, that's just how it is sometimes. But as time went on, I realized Mark had a particular dislike for me. Maybe it was because I wasn't intimidated by him, or maybe it was because other managers often came directly to me for help instead of going through him. Whatever the reason, his hostility toward me grew more obvious with each passing week. I remember one particular afternoon in the break room. I had just finished up a meeting with a cross-departmental team, and one of the marketing directors came up to thank me for catching a scheduling issue that could have cost us thousands. As soon as she walked away, Mark strolled in. "So," he said, pouring himself a coffee. "Making friends in high places, huh?" I glanced up, confused. I was just doing my job. That campaign timeline had a huge overlap with the operations rollout. If we hadn't fixed it, it would have been a mess. He smirked, not in a kind way. "Careful, Sarah. People might start thinking you're trying to step outside your lane." The way he said it sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't a joke. It was a warning. I laughed it off in the moment, but deep down, I knew I was on his radar. The weeks that followed made it clearer and clearer. He started excluding me from meetings I had always been part of. He nitpicked small mistakes in my reports, the kind of things that could happen to anyone. And worse, he started rewriting history in front of others. For example, one time we were in a team meeting discussing how to resolve a supply chain delay. I had already drafted a solution and shared it with him in an email the day before. But when he presented it, he didn't even acknowledge me. He stood at the head of the table, explaining the plan as though he'd come up with it himself. I wanted to speak up. I wanted to say, "Actually, Mark, that was my plan." But I bit my tongue. Confronting him in front of others felt dangerous, and I didn't want to seem petty. Instead, I told myself I'd pick my battles. But then came the turning point, the first time I realized he might actually be trying to push me out. It was a Friday afternoon, the end of a long week. I got an email from Mark with the subject line, "Performance Concerns." My heart sank before I even opened it. Inside was a formal-looking message, copied to HR, outlining supposed issues with my work, missed deadlines, lack of communication, and failure to follow directives. I stared at the screen in disbelief. None of it was true. I had emails, project timelines, and messages that proved otherwise. I walked straight to his office, clutching my laptop. He was sitting at his desk, scrolling through his phone like he didn't have a care in the world. "Mark," I said, my voice trembling slightly, "what is this?" I turned the screen toward him so he could see the email. He looked up lazily and shrugged. "It's exactly what it says. Your performance has been slipping, Sarah. We can't ignore that." "That's not true," I shot back. "I've met every deadline. I've got the documentation to prove it. Where is this coming from?" He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "Sarah, it doesn't really matter how you see it. What matters is how the company sees it. And right now, the company sees someone who isn't pulling their weight." The smugness in his tone made my blood boil. I realized in that moment that this wasn't about my performance at all. This was personal. He was setting me up, laying the groundwork to push me out. I walked out of his office with my head spinning. I wanted to cry, scream, maybe both. Instead, I sat at my desk, staring at my computer screen while the rest of the office started packing up for the weekend. My phone buzzed. It was a text from my best friend, Jenna. "Drinks tonight? You sound like you need it." I almost laughed. If only she knew. When we met up later at a cozy little bar downtown, I spilled everything. Jenna listened with wide eyes as I explained the email, the meeting exclusions, the stolen credit. "That's insane," she said, slamming her glass down. "He's trying to build a case against you. You can't just sit there and take it." "I don't know what to do," I admitted. "If I fight back, I'll look defensive. If I stay quiet, he'll steamroll me. Either way, I lose." Jenna leaned in, lowering her voice. "Then you need to be smarter than him. Document everything. Every email, every message, every project. If he wants to play dirty, you make sure you've got the receipts." Her words stuck with me. That night, I went home and opened a private folder on my laptop. I started collecting everything: emails, reports, project notes, even text messages. Anything that showed the truth. It was tedious, but it gave me a sense of control, a sense that maybe I wasn't as powerless as Mark wanted me to feel. What I didn't know then was that this folder, this little archive of evidence, would become my weapon. The following Monday, I walked into the office with a pit in my stomach. The performance concerns email had been sitting in my inbox all weekend like a time bomb, and I was bracing myself for whatever came next. Sure enough, by 10 a.m., I got a calendar invite from HR. The subject line made my blood pressure spike. My hands trembled slightly as I accepted the invite. It was scheduled for Wednesday. That gave me 2 days to prepare. 2 days to turn the folder I had started into something airtight. I worked late that night, scrolling through every project file from the last 6 months. Every time I found an email where I'd sent Mark an update, I saved it. Every time I found proof of a deadline I had met, I saved it. I even pulled copies of project trackers from our shared drive, documents that had timestamps, so there was no way he could twist them later. By the time midnight rolled around, my folder had grown into a massive archive. Looking at it gave me a strange sense of comfort. It was like armor. Invisible, quiet armor. On Tuesday, I kept my head down. I avoided Mark as much as possible, which wasn't easy given that his office was just a few steps from my desk. At one point, though, he made a point of stopping by. "How's the work coming along?" he asked, leaning against my cubicle wall with a fake smile plastered on his face. "Good," I said simply, not looking up from my screen. He lingered for a second as if waiting for me to squirm, but I didn't give him the satisfaction. Finally, he walked away. That night, Jenna called to check in. "Are you ready for tomorrow?" she asked. "As ready as I can be," I sighed. "I've got the receipts. Now it's just a matter of how I use them." "Promise me one thing," she said. "Don't let him see you sweat. If he wants to paint you as emotional or unstable, don't give him the ammo. Stay calm. Let the truth do the work." I promised her I would. When Wednesday arrived, I dressed carefully. A navy blazer, crisp white blouse, black slacks, professional, serious, no nonsense. I wanted to walk into that HR office looking like someone in control, not someone scrambling to defend themselves. The HR manager, Karen, was already in the conference room when I arrived. She gave me a polite smile, but it was the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. A few minutes later, Mark walked in, carrying a folder under his arm like he was the prosecutor about to put me on trial. "Thanks for coming, Sarah," Karen began once we were all seated. "We wanted to talk through some performance concerns that have been raised." Mark jumped in immediately. "Yes, as I mentioned in my email, Sarah has been missing deadlines, failing to follow directions, and creating additional workload for the team." I let him talk. I sat perfectly still, hands folded in my lap, face neutral. Inside, my heart was racing, but on the outside, I gave nothing away. When he finally paused, Karen looked at me. "Sarah, do you want to respond to that?" "Yes," I said calmly. I pulled a folder from my bag and placed it on the table. I've brought documentation of my work over the last 6 months. I believe it will clarify any misunderstandings. Mark's expression flickered for just a second, just long enough for me to see a flash of annoyance. I opened the folder and began sliding papers across the table. Here's the project tracker showing I completed the supply chain analysis 2 weeks ahead of schedule. Here's the email where I updated Mark about it. Here's the client feedback praising the adjustments I recommended. And here, I said, sliding over another sheet, is the shared drive timestamp showing when I submitted the final report. Karen flipped through the pages, her brow furrowing slightly as she scanned them. I continued, methodical and calm. For every deadline Mark has listed, I have proof of completion. For every directive he claims I failed to follow, I have emails showing I followed them exactly. I can provide the digital files if needed. By the time I finished, the table was covered in paper. Mark looked uncomfortable, but he still tried to spin it. Well, he said, forcing a chuckle, maybe she did the bare minimum, but the issue here is initiative. Sarah doesn't go above and beyond. She doesn't show leadership. I looked him straight in the eye and said evenly, that's interesting, considering that just last month, the COO emailed me personally to thank me for catching an oversight that saved the company nearly $30,000. Would you like me to pull up that email as well? Karen's head snapped up at that. You have that email? Yes, I replied. I can forward it to you right now. Mark's jaw tightened. For the first time, he didn't have a smooth comeback. The meeting ended with Karen saying she needed time to review the documentation. I left the conference room with my heart pounding, adrenaline still coursing through my veins. I hadn't just defended myself. I had planted seeds of doubt about Mark. That night, Jenna and I met for dinner. She practically squealed when I told her how it went. Oh my God, Sarah, that's perfect. You didn't just prove him wrong. You made him look like a liar. I don't know if it's enough, I admitted. He's still my boss. He still has power. Not as much as he thinks, she said with a grin. Keep documenting. Keep staying calm. If he keeps pushing, eventually he'll trap himself. I nodded, but deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Mark wasn't the type to back down quietly. If anything, he would double down. And I was right. Over the next few weeks, things got worse. He started giving me impossible deadlines, projects that would normally take a week. He wanted in 2 days. He excluded me from more meetings, then blamed me for not knowing what was going on. He even tried to assign me grunt work far below my position, as if to humiliate me. But through it all, I stayed calm. I documented every unreasonable request, every contradictory instruction, every email that showed his games. My folder grew thicker and thicker, and with it, my quiet resolve. I wasn't just defending myself anymore. I was building a case. And soon, I'd have the chance to use it. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest of my career. Every day felt like a new test, another trap Mark had set for me. Some mornings, I would sit in my car in the parking lot, gripping the steering wheel and telling myself, just make it through today. Stay calm. Document everything. Mark's tactics grew nastier. He'd send me emails at 6:30 p.m. with assignments due by 9 a.m. the next day. He'd forget to copy me on crucial information, then call me out in meetings for being uninformed. Sometimes, he'd stand behind my chair silently while I worked, as if trying to intimidate me. The others noticed too. My coworkers avoided eye contact in meetings. A few whispered to me in private, hang in there, but no one dared openly take my side. Mark had a way of making people afraid of crossing him. One Thursday afternoon, after yet another meeting where he undermined me in front of the team, I found myself in the restroom, gripping the edge of the sink. My reflection looked pale, my eyes tired. I whispered to myself, you're not crazy. You're not incompetent. He's doing this on purpose. When I got back to my desk, I noticed something strange. Mark had left his office in a rush, his computer screen still on. I normally wouldn't have glanced, but something on the monitor caught my eye, draft email. The subject line read, Performance Termination Recommendation, Sarah B. My heart skipped a beat. I couldn't see the full body of the email from where I stood, but just the subject was enough. He was preparing to fire me, and he was doing it soon. I sat back down at my desk, hands shaking, mind racing. He thinks he's won. He thinks he's finally going to push me out. That night, instead of crumbling, I doubled down. I reviewed everything in my folder, and that's when I stumbled on something bigger than I ever imagined. Buried in a chain of forwarded emails, I found correspondence between Mark and one of our vendors. At first, it looked routine, purchase orders, invoices, but then I noticed something odd. The amounts didn't match. The vendor's original invoice showed one figure, but the approved payment in our system was inflated by several $1,000s. At first, I thought it was just a clerical error. But then I found another one, and another. Each time, the extra money seemed to vanish into a consulting fee signed off by Mark. I sat there staring at the screen, my heart pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. This wasn't incompetence. This was fraud. I quickly saved copies of everything. The invoices, the approvals, the email chains. I even downloaded the metadata files from the shared drive. If Mark was cooking the books, I now had proof. I called Jenna immediately. "Jen, you're not going to believe this," I whispered into the phone, pacing my living room. "I think Mark's been embezzling money from the company." There was a pause on the other end. Then Jenna said, "Sarah, if that's true, you don't just have a defense. You have leverage. I don't know if I should take it to HR or straight to the board," I said, my voice trembling. "Not yet," she advised. "If you go too soon, they might tip him off. Keep collecting. Build your case airtight. When the time comes, you'll have one shot to drop the hammer." Her words sent a chill through me. She was right. This wasn't just about saving my job anymore. It was about exposing Mark for what he really was. Over the next week, I quietly gathered more evidence. I combed through financial records, cross-referenced invoices, and even pulled data from old project budgets. The pattern was undeniable. Mark had been siphoning money for at least a year, maybe longer. And all the while, he kept trying to crush me. He piled on more impossible assignments, sent condescending emails, and whispered to colleagues that I was on thin ice. But the more he pushed, the calmer I became. Because now, I wasn't just defending myself. I was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That moment came sooner than I expected. One Friday afternoon, Mark called me into his office. He closed the door and gave me a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Sarah," he said smoothly, "we need to talk about your future here." My stomach twisted, but I kept my face neutral. "All right." He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers like some corporate villain from a bad movie. "The truth is, this company is moving in a direction that requires stronger leadership. I just don't see you fitting into that vision. I'd suggest you consider resigning before things get formal." It was meant to scare me, to corner me into walking away quietly. But instead, I smiled faintly. "Thank you for your advice, Mark. I'll give it some thought." Inside, though, my mind was already racing. He wanted me gone before I could make a move. That meant he was nervous. That meant he suspected I had something. And he was right, because the next step I took would change everything. After that Friday meeting, the world narrowed to one thing: timing. I had the proof. I had the documentation that showed Mark's inflated invoices, the approvals, the metadata that put timestamps where they mattered. I had my own performance records, the emails where he'd tried to gaslight me, the performance concerns email he'd sent to HR. I was sitting on a dossier that would either save me or blow my life into pieces if handled clumsily. There was no room for mistakes. I told myself to breathe, plan, be smart. The first thing I did was a dry run of how I would present everything. I imagined sitting in the boardroom and laying the files across the table, hearing the gasps, watching Mark's face as he realized he wasn't the only person with access to the truth. I also imagined the other, less pleasant possibilities: Mark trying to bury the evidence, the company protecting its image by sweeping things under the rug, me becoming the scapegoat for raising the alarm. The stakes were real. I reached out to an old mentor, Alicia, who used to work in compliance at another firm. I trusted her because she had no skin in the game and because she had a meticulous mind. Over coffee, I told her what I'd found, showing her redacted screenshots at first until she agreed to look at the raw files later in a private setting. Her reaction was immediate, sharp, and steady. "This is not just sloppy accounting," she said, scrolling through the documents. "This is systematic. You could go to HR, but my advice is to take it to the audit committee or the board, somewhere with teeth. HR can be coaxed or confused. The board answers to regulations and legal counsel. If you bring the right documentation to them, you force a proper investigation. She also told me to be careful about chain of custody. How the documents were stored and shared mattered. Was there a secure way to transmit them? Could someone claim the files were tampered with? We set up a plan. I'd prepare a clean, organized package with the invoices, the approval chains, the email headers showing IP addresses and timestamps, and a clear narrative tying the pieces together. Then, she suggested I would request a confidential meeting with the board chair and the audit head. If they took it seriously, legal would be looped in, and an external auditor could verify everything. The logistics were messy. The board met quarterly. The next meeting was 3 weeks away. But the audit committee had an emergency line for whistleblower-type issues. I drafted an email, professional, neutral, factual, no accusations, only evidence, and a request for an immediate confidential review. Then I hesitated. Would they take me seriously? Would they side with Mark, who had the polished suit, the persuasive manner, the relationships built over years? I thought about Jenna's advice, stay calm. So I hit send. The response was quicker than I expected. Within 48 hours, I received a curt acknowledgement and a request for a secure meeting with the audit head the following Tuesday. The subject line read, confidential, request for review. My heart stuttered as I read it. This was happening. In the week before the meeting, I double-checked everything. I copied every file to an encrypted drive and backed it up to a secure cloud folder with controlled access logs. I printed a bound packet for the board, neat, professional, and utterly damning if the documents held. I rehearsed how I would present the timeline. The invoices, the discrepancies, Mark's approvals, the emails where he changed amounts and hiding notes, and the email draft for termination I'd glimpsed on his screen. I wrote a plain, factual narrative, no venom, no theatrical flourishes. There was nothing to gain from theatrics. Facts would do the damage. The morning of the meeting, I put on the navy blazer that had become my serious armor, drove to the office, and walked in like a woman with purpose. David, my manager, was called in as well. He looked nervous, perhaps realizing the gravity of what could happen. Mark, of course, was absent from the invite list. The audit head, an exacting woman named Lorraine, greeted me in a small conference room. Her calm, professional manner steadied me instantly. "Thank you for coming, Sarah," she said as she sat down. "We've reviewed your initial submission. Tell us, in your words, what you found." I laid out the narrative I had prepared. I spoke slowly, pointing to the invoices when I referenced them, showing the approvals, and the way figures had been altered. I explained the pattern. Vendor A's invoice was for $12,000. Approved payment was $15,000. The extra $3,000 went to a consulting fee tied to an account that traced back to a shell entity Mark had used. Another invoice, another vendor, the same pattern. I spoke about the risk to the company, financial, reputational, and legal. I also made sure to place Mark's treatment of me into context, showing how he had quietly mischaracterized my performance to discredit me in advance. Lorraine read everything with the slow, clinical attention of someone making a medical diagnosis. When she closed the thick packet and looked at me, her eyes were steady and precise. "This is serious," she said. "We will launch an independent audit immediately and place this under legal review. Until then, confidentiality is paramount. Thank you for bringing this forward." I started voice small. "You will be protected under our whistleblower policy," Lorraine assured me. "And we will handle this discreetly. Please do not discuss this matter with colleagues." Relief was immediate, hot enough to make my knees feel weak. But the meeting also set off a chain reaction. Legal and internal audit did a preliminary sweep the next day and requested more files. They wanted access to the company's payment records and vendor contracts. Lorraine's team worked fast and came back within 48 hours with a recommendation. Place Mark on administrative leave pending a full investigation. I felt vindicated, but my victory was still fragile. There was an invisible undercurrent in the office the moment Mark was put on leave. People paused in corridors, whispering. Some looked at me with newfound respect. Others avoided my gaze as if an invisible line had been drawn and they were required to choose a side. Rumors bloomed like mold in damp corners. Mark, when he was asked to collect his things, tried the old charm routine in front of HR, laughing too loudly, making jokes as if he was leaving on terms. Lorraine escorted him out politely but firmly. He shot me a look, less controlled than he ever had been in meetings. There was anger there and something like fear. The board called an emergency session, and the external auditors arrived within a week. Lorraine and the legal counsel coordinated interviews. I sat down with an auditor who asked direct, precise questions. He verified the documents and traced the shell accounts. It wasn't long before the external audit produced a preliminary report that confirmed the pattern I'd uncovered. There were difficult days. Lawyers called me in for detailed questioning. I had to be precise, back up every claim, and be ready for cross-examination at any moment. The company kept me closely involved with the investigatory process, but also gently shielded me from the rumor mill. It was a strange limbo, public in some ways, protected in others. At the same time, Mark's allies made their moves. He had supporters, clients he'd charmed, colleagues who appreciated his performance when it benefited them. There were whispers that I'd overreached, that I'd tried to sabotage a respected leader. Some suggested my complaint was retaliation for being passed over for promotion. The more entrenched players tried to muddy the waters with innuendo. But the audit's findings were clean. The paper trail did not lie. They had traced funds to shell accounts. They had records showing Mark's approvals. They had third-party confirmation from vendors. The external auditors prepared a report that left little room for manipulation. The board convened, legal counsel briefed them, and the decision was swift. Mark was terminated for cause. The company initiated a recovery process for misappropriated funds, and they promised cooperation with law enforcement. The press called, local business writers picked up the angle, and the company released a neutral statement about internal disciplinary actions without naming details. It was messy from the outside, but internally the company had done what it should. They investigated, found malfeasance, and acted. When the harrowing part of the saga finally receded, the fallout settled into something that resembled equilibrium. I was asked to meet with Lorraine and David in a private office one afternoon. They offered apologies, formal, careful, but earnest. David's tone had changed. There was real remorse for not seeing the signs. The company pledged better oversight and stricter vendor checks. Lorraine encouraged me to consider a formal role in compliance, to help rebuild systems and mentor others on protecting their work. It was an unexpected recognition, a way of channeling my experience into structural change. I took a breath. The victory felt complicated. Part of me wanted to shout, to celebrate with champagne and confetti. Another part of me ached for what had been lost, the sense of normal office camaraderie, the absence of petty gossip, the friendlier moments that now tasted ironic. Carla's situation didn't come up here because this was about a criminal pattern, not petty theft of ideas. But the lessons were similar. Speak up, gather evidence, and let systems do their work. The board also instituted a new anonymous reporting line and mandated training for managers on performance documentation and ethical handling of vendor relationships. Outside of work, people treated me differently at first. Some colleagues edged away, worried about being too close to someone who had rattled the cage. But many others reached out with support. Clients who had known me for years sent messages of encouragement. Friends threw a small dinner party to celebrate. Jenna, Alicia, a few coworkers who'd been quietly supportive. We drank, laughed awkwardly, and I allowed myself to exhale. There were legal outcomes too. The company recovered a portion of the misdirected funds, and law enforcement investigated. Mark, it turned out, had been juggling financial misconduct in other ventures too. The auditor's report prompted inquiries beyond our walls. I never wanted to see his face again, and for a long while I didn't. In the months that followed, I accepted the offer to consult with the compliance team. I helped redesign vendor approval workflows, introduced regular audit checkpoints, and pushed for clear documentation standards. I mentored staff on how to keep records, how to email summaries of meetings, and how to assert themselves with professionalism, not aggression. The hardest lesson wasn't about paperwork or procedure. It was that institutions sometimes fail people, and that sometimes you must be your own advocate. I learned to trust my instincts and also to translate them into something concrete. Proof, timestamps, emails, traces of activity. Emotions can be dismissed. Documentation cannot. At the same time, I had to reckon with the person I became in the process, someone who could hold her ground and move with quiet resolve. When I looked back, I didn't recognize the woman who'd once thought speaking up was futile. I had been forged by pressure into someone who could channel outrage into strategy. And yet, I was also kinder. I learned to notice colleagues who seemed marginalized, to ask questions before assuming competence, and to be generous with recognition. The experience had taught me the price of silence and the value of allyship. Sometimes, in meetings now, when a young team member presents an idea, I find myself saying their name, acknowledging their ownership, and making sure it's recorded. It's a small thing, but it feels important. It is how change begins. There were quieter delights. Getting promoted into a role where I had more influence, riding the subway and not replaying the worst days, laughing with friends about absurd HR drama. The company felt steadier. People seemed more guarded, but also more honest. The structural changes I'd helped implement reduced the chance of another Mark being able to manipulate the books or scapegoat someone like me. People sometimes ask if I regret raising the alarm, that it cost me peace, increased stress, and changed relationships. My answer is always the same. I don't regret it. Not because I like the fight, but because truth matters. Because organizations that hide wrongdoing do so at the expense of every honest person who works there. If anything, the experience made me more committed to fairness. I started volunteering with a nonprofit that supports whistleblowers, helping them understand how to document and protect themselves. I wanted the next person who found themselves in my shoes to have an easier path. As for Mark, the last I heard, he faced charges in coordination with local authorities. The company moved on, the audit recommendations took root, and we all learned to be a little more careful. Life continued as it always does. When I think back to that day when I first sat in Mark's office with the performance concerns email burning in my inbox, I remember the raw fear. But I also remember the slow, deliberate transformation that followed. How fear turned into methodical action. How silence turned into an organized, factual account of truth. And now, when I mentor someone or sit in a board meeting and hear a manager speak a little too confidently about someone else's performance issues, I hear the echo of that old voice and I know when to pay attention. Standing up for myself was never about proving I was right. It was about demanding integrity,